Hi everyone, it's Molly. Today I'm going to talk to you all about Margaret Sanger. Margaret was a well-known birth control activist in the early to mid 20th century. Margaret founded the birth control movement and became an outspoken lifelong advocate for women's reproductive rights. Before getting into who Margaret Sanger was and what she did, it is essential to look at what inspired her. Margaret's mother experienced 18 pregnancies. 11 resulted in children who survived, and 7 ended in miscarriage. Sanger's life course was shaped by the poverty of her childhood and the death of her mother at age 50 of tuberculosis, which Sanger understood resulted from the physical toll of pregnancy. This inspired her to become a nurse in her early 20s, working in the Lower East Side of New York City. Sanger saw the devastating effects of unsafe abortion, lack of contraceptives, and autonomy during pregnancy. Lacking effective contraceptives, many women were forced to resort to unsafe abortions. It was after these abortions that Sanger was usually called in to care for these women. Her early life experiences inspired her advocacy work. I included a quote from one of Margaret's pieces, emphasizing her commitment to reproductive autonomy. She says, "No woman can call herself free who does not own and control her body." You will learn throughout this presentation that Sanger had involvement in so many aspects of the birth control movement. From her writing to the opening of America's first birth control clinic to her direct care for people seeking reproductive health care, she truly was a trailblazer in the movement. She was born in Corning, New York in 1879, and she eventually moved to New York City, where her nursing career and advocacy efforts originated, as I mentioned in the prior slide. One of Sanger's well-known advocacy efforts were through her publications. The Comstock Act of 1873 prevented the mailing and receiving of contraceptive or abortion materials. It also prevented information and writing about birth control, but Margaret did it anyways. She found creative avenues such as framing her writings as medical content or distributing it privately to avoid being caught. She would eventually become arrested anyways. She fled to Europe to avoid prosecution, but that bold move only amplified public attention and helped push the country toward loosening the laws that banned birth control information. Some of Sanger's most notable accomplishments include opening America's first birth control clinic, which would eventually become what we now know as Planned Parenthood. In 2021, Planned Parenthood removed Margaret Sanger Square signage in New York City, which was a plaque dedicated to Sanger's role in founding the organization due to her eugenic ideology, which I will talk about more in a later slide. Additionally, Sanger founded or co-founded the American Birth Control League, the Birth Control Clinical Research Bureau, and the International Planned Parenthood Federation. Again, as I mentioned earlier, Sanger was a very busy gal. I probably could spend 8 minutes alone on her advocacy and legal reform efforts, but for the sake of time, I chose the most notable and transformational moments of her life. Every event on this timeline reflects a moment where Sanger played a significant and influential role. Beginning in 1914, when she coined the term birth control, she first used it in her publication, The Woman Rebel. She was indicted for 9 violations of the Comstock Law, but as I mentioned earlier, she fled to Europe to avoid the charges. In 1916, she opened the Brownsville Clinic, which was first staffed by herself and by her sister. Medical providers feared to work there because of the Comstock Law. She was arrested yet again for opening the clinic, but with bail money, support from select physicians, publicity, and community support, it continued to operate. In 1931, she founded the American Birth Control League, which would eventually become Planned Parenthood. By 1937, the American Medical Association recognized the use of birth control by doctors as medical practice, and 18 years later, the FDA would approve the oral contraceptive pill. In Sanger's final years, the Supreme Court legalizes birth control for married couples in Griswold versus Connecticut. Throughout these milestones, Sanger played a central role. Through her decades of advocacy, education, and organizing, Sanger shaped the landscape of reproductive rights in the United States. While Margaret was fiercely independent, she could not make the strides she did doing it alone. Beginning with sources of support, socialist, radical, and feminist reform groups backed her due to their similar goals. Another source of support was folks who went to her clinics. Another form of support was physicians who were brave enough to work for her, and eventually the American Medical Association, recognizing birth control as a legitimate part of medical practice. Her family, especially her sister, that staffed the Brownsville Clinic when it first opened, were great sources of support for Margaret. The sources of resistance were loud, but Sanger creatively worked through them nonetheless. The biggest source of resistance I found was societal attitudes limiting conversation around women's reproductive rights and healthcare. It was extremely taboo to talk about, making her work very controversial. The Catholic Church was also another big source of resistance, speaking out against her clinics and publications. Some of women's suffrage groups, such as the League of Women's Voters and the National Women's Party, all viewed birth control as too controversial to endorse. These suffragists feared contraceptive advocacy could threaten women's claim to full citizenship and political power. And finally, the federal government, enforcing laws such as the Comstock Act, made it very challenging to gain public support and advocate for these ideas without being criminalized. Personally and ethically, I cannot do a presentation on Margaret Sanger without discussing some of her harmful eugenic ideology that she subscribed to. These quotes are from one of Sanger's pamphlets titled The Eugenic Value of Birth Control Propaganda, published in 1921. First quote, "Birth control is nothing more or less than the facilitation of the process of weeding out the unfit." Second is, "The most urgent problem today is how to limit and discourage the overfertility of mentally and physically defective." In my mind, this is inexcusable language, despite the time period that it was written. Margaret advocated for women to have autonomy over their reproductive rights, but seemed to have a specific vision in mind of who should benefit. Throughout the research process, I found an interesting article written by a historian with the University of Massachusetts. It describes scholars' perspectives on Sanger's harmful ideology. One scholar in specific described Sanger's use of the eugenic logic as an avenue to enable the reproductive rights movement. The scholar concluded that despite many disgusting ramifications of eugenics, eugenic language had crucially enabled the reproductive rights movement. Additionally, he argued that Sanger's ambitious program of legalizing contraception in the United States and building an international network of clinics had no chance of legislative support without gaining allies with unsavory agendas. Ultimately, her legacy forces us to hold two truths at once. Her work expanded reproductive freedom, but the language she used to advance that mission was extremely harmful. Again, it is extremely important to name this and recognize that this ideology is completely unacceptable. So, why should we care about all this, and what can we take away from learning about Margaret Sanger? Her advocacy efforts were bold, strategic, and transformational. She fought for self-determination, which is an ethical responsibility that NASW determined for social workers. Historical knowledge of reproductive rights provides essential context for present-day struggles, such as the overturning of Roe v. Wade and the ongoing struggle for equitable access and the right of choice in reproductive health care. Lastly, Sanger's story is a powerful reminder that expanding access to any resource should always be guided by an anti-oppressive framework. That's all I have for you. Thank you for bearing with me. That was a lot of information in a short amount of time. And Ashley, here are my references.